Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about fish. But as you can probably tell from the title, not just any fish, an extremely intelligent fish that seems to be able to communicate and seems to possess brain, or more specifically cerebellum, which you can see in blue here, that's extremely enlarged compared to a lot of other animals and a lot of other vertebrates, including humans. Which of course implies that this fish, by body mass, has more brain than human beings. But it's not this fish right here, it's not clownfish. And it's not a fish that a lot of us are familiar with, unless of course fish and aquariums are your hobby. Something that I personally myself do not know much about. However, discovering the existence of this fish known as Mormyridae, also known as freshwater elephant fish, with the elephant fish of course coming from the fact that all of these fish have these long protrusions from their mouth, was a pretty big surprise, especially because I did not realize they were that intelligent or had such big brains. But more importantly, we're actually talking about one specific feature that a lot of these Mormyridae seem to possess. This feature being very complex communication. Communication that was recently identified and analyzed even more in one of the recent studies you can find in the description, that essentially suggests that these fish communicate extremely similar to humans and a lot of other really complex animals. They communicate using pauses and they seem to produce speech and patterns of speech not so different from what you would find in some other really complex animals such as dolphins, such as certain types of birds, and of course us. And these pauses suggest that there's a lot of really complex, sentences or complex pieces of information that are produced by these fish when they are in their natural environment. In other words, this is literally a talking fish, a fish that communicates with other fish. And not just communicates with some simple signals or some simple chemical processes, it communicates using complex speech patterns. And so let's discuss a little bit more details about this unusual creature, what we know about it, and what we kind of think happened in their evolutionary history. Okay, so let's start right here. I think a lot of different cultures around the world, including Eastern European cultures, Asian cultures, and some German cultures, have the story of the talking fish. Usually it's a goldfish, but sometimes it's something entirely different. And in this case, the fish usually provides some sort of wisdom to the human and possibly maybe make some promises. And I remember reading those stories when I was younger, and it always sort of fascinated me. But I think most of us kind of assumed that this was just a fairy tale and not something that was actually possible. Because unlike other animals, most of us sort of assume that fish, for the most part, are not particularly smart. In other words, attributing intelligence to fish is not something we kind of naturally do. But because there are so many different fish out there, and because there are a lot of possibilities for developing intelligence in various species, it's only natural to make an assumption that somewhere out there, there's going to be at least one fish that develops complex intelligence and of course complex communication skills. Which would of course make sense because, for example, there are a lot of birds that are not particularly smart, but there are also birds that are absolute geniuses. And so you would expect something similar to happen to fish. But what exactly happened and how did it happen? Well, the scientists for the past few years have been trying to figure out why certain type of Mormyridae possessed larger brains than usual. And of 200 species of Mormyridae, this one right here, the average looking Gnathonamus petersii, also known as Peter's elephant nose fish, by body mass ratio seems to possess the largest brain of all vertebrates, bigger than humans, and that implies only one thing, well maybe two things. It implies that there's a lot of intelligence going on inside these fish, especially because their cerebellum seems to be much bigger than some of the other specimens, and it also implies that these unusual fish require a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of oxygen in order to have those brains operate at optimum performance levels. Which of course means that they can probably only survive in oxygen-rich areas of different rivers, and they also have to very likely consume a lot of high-energy food. And interestingly, just like with mammals, specifically with humans and with a lot of apes, as the brains of these fish increased in size, the guts and the intestines of these fish decreased in size, allowing the body to conserve more energy, and this implies that they probably only survive on extremely nutritious food. In case of humans, we basically learn how to cook and how to extract nutrition from various food products. But in case of these fish, well, they seem to live in areas where a lot of highly nutritious worms, for example, usually hide in very murky waters. And it's the life in these murky conditions where it's extremely difficult for the fish to see that sort of allowed them to evolve what they have today, their large brains. Because they lived in conditions where it was extremely dark and very, very difficult to see anything with eyes, over time they evolved the ability to communicate using electricity. Here's sort of what their body looks like. They possess a lot of different electroreceptors all over the body, with a lot of them present inside their mouth-like formations. And they also have their own electric organ that generates electricity using an electrocyte, which is a cell that was originally a muscle cell but eventually learned how to produce electricity. And generally they produce electricity in the frequency of about 500 Hz. But unlike some other fish that usually use this to maybe catch prey by electrifying them, or use electricity in self-defense, these unusual fish instead use this directly to communicate with one another. And it's very likely that this communication method only developed because of the murky conditions where they live. Mostly because it's so difficult for them to see anything, over time they adapted to use this electrocommunication for various needs and for various types of communication. But because of the ability to communicate using electro signals, this then led their brains to develop over time, with some of these Mormyridae having relatively small cerebellum, but other ones developing a huge cerebellum in comparison, as their communication complexity increased and as they started to produce various types of, well, fish speech, or fish language, or whatever you want to call it. And they seem to use this communication for a lot of different things. For example, it was already discovered that certain signals are used to identifying mates, or identifying specific individuals that they're next to, and also for providing information about the sex of the actual fish. Is this a male fish or a female fish? Although interestingly enough, apparently people that have these fish in different fish tanks are usually unable to identify their gender unless they use some sort of an electrode to try to listen to their electrocommunication, and in that case it becomes possible to see if it's a male or a female. However, inside a typical fish tank or an aquarium, some of these fish tend to develop different electric impulses and sometimes even reverse their sexual signals, which means that their partners are unable to differentiate between different genders anymore, and it becomes very difficult for these fish to reproduce if they live in artificial conditions inside a fish tank. But it seems that prior to the development of this complex brain and complex communication, this particular species was not really that successful, and it was only after the development of this ability to communicate and to use these electrical signals that this unusual fish exploded in its evolution and became one of the most widespread fish in fresh waters of Africa. And Africa is really the only continent where you can currently find them in their natural habitat. And a lot of these recent studies discovered some really cool things about their communication. And remember, this is just using those electrical signals. For example, they tend to use various types of echoes, kind of similar to dolphins and, I guess, bats, to both locate themselves and also to provide information to other fish. They also tend to exhibit something that we usually refer to as word recognition, when the listener usually stops talking and starts listening, waiting for a certain meaning of a certain word. They do so by essentially pausing their own electrical signals and resuming their electrical activity once the first speaker finished talking. Also interestingly, when putting a lot of these fish in the same fish tank or in the same environment, some of them will stop producing electrical signals completely, especially when one of the fish is extremely active in its electrical stimulation. And in this particular case, it resembles one person talking and other fish listening. At the same time, by placing a fish alone in a fish tank, the scientists realized that it was producing a lot less electrical signals and was almost not producing any pauses at all. It's as if that fish was kind of mumbling to itself and not really listening to anyone anymore. But by placing two fish, they were able to see that one of the fish would always pause when the other fish was talking. And so in this case, it really demonstrated that the best animal communication, or the best type of fish communication in this case, always resulted in some sort of a silence from one fish or the other. But more importantly, they also noticed that when one of these fish needed to communicate a lot of information all at the same time, it would always take a long pause beforehand, as if preparing all of its listeners that were about to receive a lot of really important advice. Surprisingly, they identified that the actual timescale for these pauses were extremely similar to human speech as well. Which of course to the scientists in the study implied that similar cellular processes must be happening inside the brains of these fish to what happens inside our brains as well. And so a pause of about 1 second would sort of prime their partner or their listener to suddenly receive a lot of important information. But this is not unique to humans and these fish. This also seems to happen in a lot of birds, this also seems to happen in many different mammals. And even frogs, certain types of frogs, experience these pauses and this type of communication as well. Which of course does not imply that these fish are the smartest animals on the planet. They're still probably really smart and they probably still are going to surprise us with some other discoveries, but I wouldn't really expect them to solve any calculus anytime soon. As a matter of fact, except for this complex communication, they do not seem to possess a lot of other intelligence typical of some other intelligent animals, such as for example tool use. Nevertheless, this still makes this fish one of the most interesting, most fascinating, and most mysterious vertebrates on the planet. A strange fish that seems to have evolved very complex communication skills, which then led to its evolutionary success in certain regions of Africa. And because these fish vary in size and complexity, similar to how, for example, monkeys and apes are different, with the smallest fish being about 5 centimeters in size, and the largest being about 1.5 meters, or roughly around 5 feet. This by itself does show how successful this particular species has become simply because of that one skill of complex communication. But obviously we're not going to be able to interpret what they're saying anytime soon, and we're probably not going to be discovering a way to talk to them either. All of this is right now beyond our capabilities. Also, chances are they are not really saying anything super smart either. But there's one thing I wanted to mention before I finish this video, and it's the fact that because of this complexity and because of their brain right now, evolutionarily speaking, these fish do have a lot of problems coming in the future, specifically because their brains require way more oxygen than even our brains. About 60% of the entire oxygen consumption in this fish goes to its brain. And this actually means that these fish require very specific conditions to survive. And since they only live in fresh waters of Africa, it's extremely easy for these fish to lose their habitat and thus become extinct. And so in that sense, because of their complexity and because of this very specific adaptation, they also have a much higher chance of going extinct if suddenly all of the waters or much of the water in Africa suddenly becomes either less oxygenated or stops producing nutritious materials they need to survive. Which means that they do have a chance to go extinct if the conditions in those waters suddenly change. Their brains are just not going to be able to survive if the oxygen levels are much lower. But at the moment, it's not really a problem. It's just something that theoretically could happen. But anyway, on that note, well, that's pretty much it, and pretty much all I wanted to mention about this incredible, unusual, and mysterious fish. Definitely something to think about, and something to explore on your own using some of the studies in the description below. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Either way, stay wonderful, and as always, bye bye.